So, ladies and gentlemen, we now have two new people up on stage. It's my great pleasure to welcome on stage Goran Oman, who is the Senior Advisor at the Swedish Public Employment Service, and also to invite on stage Bastien Diblek, who is the Semantic Technology Business Unit Manager at Tenforce, which is an impressive title, I have to say. But Goran, you're on stage first. You can use...
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll stay here, I think. Okay, I will give you a very, very short introduction to the magical world of mapping. I don't want to recapitulate everything we have been talking about yesterday. Let's see if is this working? Yes. But I want to stress a few very important points when it comes to mapping. First of all, ESCO is essentially an interoperability tool for mapping two classifications to each other. It is not an application in itself, so it doesn't replace classifications. If you have a classification, you can map it to ESCO and thereby communicate with other classifications, other applications. Secondly, a very important point is also that we aim to participate in the shift to a more skills, competences approach to matching, since we know that that is what is happening in the market. That it is more stress now on competences and skills, and a little less on job titles, occupations. And I thought it was very interesting yesterday to hear from VDAB that their employers, 60% of their employers annotated skills and competences in their system. We also hope that by mapping several taxonomies to each other, all of them will benefit and become more rich in concepts, in values, because you will find that when you start mapping that there are concepts in another classification, in ESCO, that you might want to introduce in your own classification. There are some obvious use for mapping, of course. Cross-border job matching is perhaps the most common use of mapping, but also career guidance, the way to show learning outcomes, and to compare national statistics between countries. Essentially, ESCO is a hub, the grand central station of combining classifications. So the great thing about it is that if you're, for instance, classification D, you only have to map to ESCO, and thereby your classification system is automatically mapped to all other classifications that have been mapped to ESCO. So this is the very cost-effective way of communicating across sectors, across Europe, with a minimal effort. And this is a more, I would say, romantic picture. For instance, if we have a French musician who is very, very fond of Chopin and really wants to work in Poland, this will facilitate his possibilities to easily find a musician's work in Poland. So this picture illustrates how the mapping will combine values in different systems through ESCO, the hub. There are 4 steps to a successful mapping. First of all, it is important to make a plan to begin with. And this plan consists of 3 important steps. First of all, you have to be sure what do you want to use this interoperability for. Do you want to start with cross-border interoperability? Do you want to disseminate your own information to other parties, other countries? Do you want to capture information from other parties? So it's important to decide where do you want to start. Of course, you can do many things with ESCO, but I think to begin with, it is very important to have a clear plan. What is it that you want to do in the first step? try to get a full understanding of the structure and the status of your own classification system and compare that to ESCO, because I think that you have to work from a more general level and work your way down to be successful. So you have to start by combining your classification system to ESCO on the uppermost level. And then in the planning process, I also think it is important to take into account the maintenance question. That is a very boring question, often. But I think that to start with, you have to take into account the staffing, the funding it will take to maintain your mapping. Then when it comes to developing, you have to make a logical mapping. And I have done that a few times at home in Sweden. And they say that the devil's in the detail, but I would say in this case, don't get stuck in the details right away from the start. Because I think here we have a golden rule of 80-20 or maybe 95-5, that most of it will be mapped rather easily. And then you take on the problems later on, because it's very easy to get stuck in problems to begin with. And also, keep in mind the interoperability purpose of mapping. You don't have to have an exact mapping in every detail. I usually compare it to language translations. My fellow Swedish citizens may excuse me, but I believe that English is much more richer language than Swedish for natural reasons. It's a wonderful mix of Anglo-Saxon and French, so they have a very much greater vocabulary than Swedish. But still, we can talk to each other because we have sort of mapped, translated our languages to each other. So it's feasible and it's necessary for us to translate Swedish texts to English and vice versa. And this goes for classifications too. Don't be afraid if you don't have all the details of your classification in ESCO or vice versa. And then, of course, it's the technical mapping, which is, if the logical mapping has been done in a good way, the technical mapping is usually no big problem. Then you have to decide what technical formats you want to use and so on, but the logical mapping is the most important part. And finally, again, maintaining. Very important, but often neglected. You have to have a plan how to maintain your mapping to ESCO, because otherwise the mapping, the classification will start to deteriorate. So that is very, very important. However, on a positive note, if you update your classification to ESCO, it will automatically be updated to all other classifications that has been mapped to ESCO. Okay, I think I'll stop there and let my colleague continue.
Goran, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we are in this session on mapping, which is, of course, a critical component of ESCO. We're just going to hear Bastien, and then once we've heard both presentations, I'm going to be coming. This is the moment to ask any questions that you might have on mapping. So as you're listening to the speakers, please make a note. I don't understand this, or I have a question about that. How do I do this bit of the mapping? Now's the moment to ask. But first of all, Bastien, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will briefly go into the mechanics and the logistics of mapping. I will neglect all possible technological and technology challenges that are present in this area, and I will also oh my God I will also neglect all possible semantic and related discussions. Now, mind, I'm a linguist by education, so I know what's going on, so don't worry. But I will just briefly explain you that mapping is possible, feasible, that there are the technological means to do it, and that it's a matter of focus and time and investments. So I will briefly explain that. Mapping is possible. Thank you. Okay, and now I will zoom in into some of the details. So what is a mapping? The good thing about nice pictures is that they reappear in conferences, and that the value is becoming more and more clear. But what is mapping in ESCO and with national classifications? That is making links or connecting concepts, terms, whatever words, phrases, based on correspondence. Yes, there are other ways to make links or mappings between taxonomies. That is, that you can expand certain branches within a taxonomy, but in this domain, in this case, we are clearly talking about making the connection between parts of the taxonomies that share some correspondence. So more specifically, zooming in on the Polish taxonomy and ESCO, you will see that there is some correspondence that can be clearly identified, and we can map, although this is a decision to be taken by a machine or by a human, or by a human supported by a machine, we can map these two terms or a couple of these terms to each other, and in this way make a connection between the ESCO taxonomy and the Polish taxonomy. Okay? Why do we do this, and what does it help to support? Basically, the most important reason why we should do this in the context of public employment services in Europe and ESCO is to support the matching of CVs internationally, of course. Yeah? So suppose on the left side we have an indexed CV that is done with, or indexed or categorized or tagged or whatever you want to call it. It is tagged with the French taxonomy or the French classification system. On the right side we have an indexed vacancy with the Polish classification. Through ESCO and through the correspondence relations that have been made on the ESCO level between the national taxonomies and ESCO, we can easily, you can see it, work our way from the vacancy to the CV or the other way around. So we can easily link these two. Yeah? Now again, I'm making absolute no statements about technology and how to do this. You will have to believe me now that this can be done with technology. So we have technology, or there is technology. It's not only available in my shop, but there is technology to support this mapping, and there is technology to support this matching in these kinds of environments, yeah, of which the EURES platform is really a nice example that is growing towards this kind of CV and vacancy matching platform. And that's me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bastien, thank you very much. Mapping. Ladies and gentlemen, you're all going to have to do it. Any questions? We have two experts on the stage at the moment. Here we go.
Claudia Bleimauer, 3S. If ESCO wants to be a good target for mapping, it has to have certain characteristics. For example, trivial ones that no occupational concept is present in the classification under different names, that all occupations present at the same level of the hierarchy have the same level of detail and so on. Otherwise, it is very, very difficult for national classifications to be mapped onto ESCO. Is there already a roadmap in place to ensure that ESCO really is a good mapping target?
which of you would like to, or would you both like to comment on that? They're rather hoping the other one does, because it's a difficult question.
In the ESCO group, we have, of course, the ambition to provide you with guidelines and even with software tools that might help you. What you saw here, the connection between the Polish and the French classifications was made through ESCO. I think it was ESCO 88, right? And that is, of course, something that public employment services and also other employment services very often already use. And then you can use that as an intermediate tool to map your classifications. Then there are, of course, other sectors, other users of ESCO that don't have that easy access to get a base for mapping, because then you have to go through it. But then your question was, what do I do if I have a job or an occupation that doesn't even exist in ESCO? Was that your question? No? Okay.
My question is, for example, you want to map the Austrian occupation IT Lehrer, IT teacher, onto an occupation that offers IT instructor, IT trainer, IT educator in the taxonomy. So provides three concepts, one concept under three different names. My question was, how will you ensure the internal consistency of ESCO is good enough to be a good target for mapping?
Just before we do that, I have a comment here from Vito, and then gentleman over there as well.
I think it is a very good question, and there are two different answers, in the sense that one part of the answer is there needs to be an ex ante principle established for the reference groups, and the maintenance committee has had the possibility to state this principle, and we have absorbed it in the guidelines. And so we have communicated this to the reference groups. They are very well aware that they are working at concept level, and if there are synonyms, they should, or alternative terms, they will be reported in the classification as non-preferred terms. There is also an ex post check that the maintenance committee, I think, has the possibility to do after the output is delivered to the maintenance committee for quality assurance. And in that case, if we find, of course, terms that refer to the same concept, then we have some work to do to make sure that they are brought together.
Now, very good. We've got lots of hands. We've got the gentleman over there, and the gentleman over there, the gentleman over there, and then the lady here.
For those of you who don't know me, my name's David Hunter. I'm from the International Labour Organisation, where I'm responsible for ESCO, the International Standard Classification of Occupations. In general, to the extent that ESCO is linked to ISCO, all occupations in the world should be covered. That's not to say there aren't emerging ones. I think, based on the bit of a look I've had at ESCO so far, at the very detailed level at the moment, there are still some problems with multiple occupation titles for one concept. So I've seen, for example, army surgeon and regimental surgeon, which for me seems to be the same concept. So I think there is certainly a need for some quality control from the maintenance committee there. My question relates, however, directly to mapping. And it's, to what extent are you recommending collaboration with, for example, national statistical offices, collaboration between public employment services and national statistical offices? National statistical offices use occupation classifications to code occupation collected in the census, in surveys, and from various administrative sources, and will already have mapped their national classifications to ISCO. In some countries it will be the same as the classification used by the public employment services. In other countries it will be different. So for me, it seems to me to be essential to ensure that the Public Employment Service and the Statistical Office at least compare notes. And in terms of getting consistent information and consistent statistics from these two different sources, maintaining that link accurately and correctly is vitally important.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question here, very quickly.
It's very fast. Saverio Pescuma from Italy. I would like to know if you plan to release. I have downloaded the first version of ESCO. If you plan to release even in different formats, such like JSON, for example, because you just released it in XML. And another suggestion: I have seen in this file, the source file, and even in some of the presentation of yesterday, that there are many mistakes with the translations, at least in Italian. Yesterday, one occupation was completely invented. Well, I don't remember. In Italian, it was revisore dei conti. I don't know how you translated it. So my suggestion is maybe in the future use the same mechanism that you use with Europass. Use some national agency in order to check the translation, because we are speaking about standards. If this translation is not really correct, it would be a problem to adopt it. Thank you very much.
We're just going to take the remaining questions, because then we need to stop. So please, sir.
Rolf Aslaksrud Christiansen from Norway, and I've been involved in developing some of the sectoral qualifications. So my question in this context will be, how will the mapping with the sectorally defined qualifications be managed? Because yesterday we had Luisa's presentation on the welding sector. There are several other sectors which are also relevant for a mapping procedure. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to support very much David Hunter's plea for taking contact with national statistical offices, because they have coding indexes to ESCO. And my second issue is that I've understood that you have language coding, but be aware that even though Flanders and the Netherlands have the same language, they by far not have the same occupational titles. So please, so it follows also the Italian, have a check for your occupational titles.
Any final thoughts and questions before I hand back to the panel? Gentlemen, wow, okay. You've kicked up a storm.
How many hours do you have? But no, I think we have to approach this in a different way, and I will not speak for the Commission, but at this moment, definitely not on its future plans, but I can tell you at this moment, and what it's the message that you get out of this conference, mapping is a natural next step, and is a necessary step to bring the value of this multilingual taxonomy to the rest of Europe. Yeah? That is absolutely clear from this conference. Now, the questions by Claudia on basically ESCO quality and the questions about alignment with statistical taxonomies, the questions about translations and about the technical format in which this will be delivered. And again, I will not speak on behalf of the Commission, but I think I can say that it has the intention to attack all these areas. Yeah? And I'm looking at Wallis and she's nodding. So, but of course, the focus to date was on making available and publishing the taxonomy as it is today. And I think, in my personal opinion, the team did quite a good job. So there is a taxonomy. It can be used. With that, there were some guidelines on how to expand it, to improve it, to extend it. So I'm quite sure if the Commission applies the same thorough approach to mapping, that together with a lot of people in this room, we will come to some decent mapping results in the next coming years, I would say. Okay.
Well, as a representative for public employment services, natural that we align with our statistical agencies in each country, of course. So we already do that, and they are using, at least in Sweden, ESCO, and I guess in most other countries too. But what I find interesting in the ESCO approach is that if there are countries or other bodies that are not using ESCO, this is also a way to compare statistics, maybe between sectors or so on. So ESCO is not only to be used for job matching or vocational guidance or career guidance, but it also has a potential, if we are successful, of course, to facilitate the comparing of statistics.
Thank you very much. Well, mapping is a big issue and it's difficult, and we therefore would like to go through a specific exercise, but again this involves dividing you into two groups. So might I ask those participants that represent public and private employment services, could you stand up? Stay standing up. Could those participants that work with classification systems that they want to map to ESCO version 0, please stand up. The others remain standing as well. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, would you follow me? Catherine, I'm handing over to you. Karen, I'm handing over to you. The others, please stay here. Karen will now be your hostess. The others, please follow me.
So I will try to take over from Martin, and of course I will apologize beforehand. I'm not such a facilitator as Martin is, but I will try to do my best. We will have a session here now on more general aspects. Martin and the other group are going into technical detail of mapping classifications, and we will keep it on a more general level. For those of you who had questions in the former session that have been unanswered, and that were more of the technical kind, please be aware that we will put the answers on our portal, because we realize that some specific answers have to be given, but it's just out of scope and too technical to deal with that here on the platform. So your questions will be answered, and if there are any questions remain, please also send them to us, and we will be sure that you will get your answers, how we will deal with these questions. For now, then, I want to introduce you to my colleagues Aldo and Vito, and they will present to you something about European interoperability framework and how ESCO fits in that. And after that, we will have a questions and answer session. Thank you, Vito. Sorry, Aldo.
Okay, thank you, Karen. this is going to be a much lighter session than the ones that we have had today, this morning, and yesterday, basically. We have heard a lot about what ESCO is, about taxonomies, about semantic interoperability, but in reality, how much do we know about the world of interoperability? And how much, therefore, we try to put the word interoperability into practice and what it means to our daily lives. So I will start with a very complex definition of interoperability, which is the facilitation of cross-border and cross-sector information exchange, taking into account legal, organization, semantic, and technical aspects. For those of you who are Greek in the room, might have understood it, but for the rest, probably it is Greek. In other words, interoperability is the ability to share information between systems, applications in a meaningful ways, which means that the data and information is being shared is not only meaningful, it is shared in the same representation and has the same meaning that is done by the sender as well as by the receiver. So why is interoperability needed in the bigger picture for us citizens, for the businesses out there? It is because of the European single market. It is because now more people are moving cross-border, more businesses are opening in another member states, and therefore citizens and businesses are making use of their freedoms and rights of the single market. What does this do? This entails the contact with public administrations, which means that when you move to another country, when you move to another member state, what you do, you go and register in that country. If you carry a firearm, for example, you have to register. If you come up with your vehicle, you have to do a new car registrations. And therefore, those interactions with the public administrations of another country are generally where the problems are. It is needed, therefore, from a business point of view and from a citizen point of view. As said, from a citizen, when you go and work in another country, when you seek for health services in another country, when you study in another country, and for the businesses, it's the same thing as when you try to open a business in another country. There is, however, a big stumbling block, which are the e-barriers. And this is the interoperability is needed to address those e-barriers. On top of those, there's also the language barriers that we have. And therefore, what does interoperability try to do? It tries to address those barriers to make interoperability easier and to make that information exchange between public administrations a trusted one. So let us imagine the real, not real actually, let us imagine a perfect Europe where all the member states and all the public administrations are fully interoperable. What does it address for? So we have three things. The first one is that the full cooperation between the public administrations to establish the public services. So public administrations, before they start to develop any public service or e-government service, so to speak, they see who is currently as well developing that type of e-government service. And they call on to them to work together, to collaborate together. In that case, they also are willing to exchange information between the two of them. Yes? If a public administration wants to develop any government service, and no one, incidentally, is encouraged in that project at the moment, what do we do? In a perfect case scenario, we share and reuse these government services. What are the results, therefore, of a perfect, interoperable public administration in Europe? There is an improved public sector, so the services are fully interoperable. You move from one country to the other with your data that moves with you, fully interoperable. You go and seek a job in another member state, your CV is fully compatible with the employers of another member state. You go to seek for health services, your medical file is seen in their language, fully understood, so on and so forth. What is in it for the public services? Lower cost. And in this time of austerity and crisis in the economy, lower costs definitely would come welcome at this stage. Now, the next bit will be a very short video to summarize exactly what I said, but in a more of a harmonious way with some music in the background. Please.
Public administrations are striving hard to have state-of-the-art ICT systems supporting efficient services for citizens and businesses. Within the European Union, we travel, study, and do business across countries. Therefore, there's a need for common and interoperable e-government solutions in Europe. However, most countries have built their national e-systems separately. And sometimes it doesn't work. How can we build an interoperable Europe? Firstly, we need to make sure that machines can talk to each other by using interoperable software. Otherwise, secondly, we need syntactical and semantic conventions. That means we need to agree on the language and the format to use to exchange information and to translate it automatically. Otherwise, and finally, we should follow the same rules. Otherwise, if we join forces on these three levels, we achieve the harmonious collaboration we're looking for. An interoperable Europe. Interested?
Thank you for the video. So now that we are all experts in interoperability, we should move on to the next step, which is what is the European Commission doing on interoperability? The list that I have here is not exhaustive. And I will focus mostly on what guides us in terms of interoperability as part of the whole Commission, and not on individual initiatives by different DGs and Commission services, basically. The ESA program, which is the Interoperability Solutions for Public Administrations, is a funding program. It is a successor to previous 3 other programs, all in regards to interoperability for the last 15 years. They all have been funding programs, and they all have had almost the same amount of funding. We're talking about 150, 160 million in terms of 5-year programs. What does it do? It funds actions and horizontal measures and projects for European public administrations, which means for you, for the people who are working in ministries, for the people who are working in the PESs, for those who are working at the European level as well in the institutions, through the funding of certain mechanisms and actions. Some of these actions include, for example, just to give you an idea, the European Citizens Initiative, development of the software itself. And this has been already reused and shared by multiple public administrations. It is the validation of the signatures of the European citizens that is actually done in this way. In the semantic technologies, which is one of the most famous actions under this program, it carries more than 1.5 billion budget per year. Here we're talking about actions like the federating of semantic asset repositories from all across Europe. So when one tries to find a semantic asset, one could actually not only look for one public administration, but all over Europe. The sharing and reuse of common solutions. What we mean by common solutions are those solutions, semantic assets, and others that we have seen so far that will be easily transferred, easily shared, and easily redeveloped into one's own public administration, as I said before, to save a lot of money, so on and so forth. Community building actions, like the ones that we have here today, to come together, to talk, to discuss as human beings the way forward and to agree how we should go. The National Interoperability Framework Observatory, which is also known as the NIFO, is an action based on 28 member states and beyond. It is an action where it gives the status, the general state of play of interoperability on a general level of each of the member states. On top of that, it also supports the public administrations to align their interoperability initiatives to the EIF, the European Interoperability Framework. But what is it exactly, the European Interoperability Framework? One of the 7 flagship initiatives of the Europe 2020 strategy is basically a Commission communication. One of them is specifically targeted towards interoperability for the European public services. What does it aim to do? It establishes a common approach towards the effective delivery of interoperability. Why? Because we would not like to have a lot of public administrations doing interoperability the way they want and without having the same direction to go to. And therefore, it's good to have this in a close collaboration and going towards in the same direction. In fact, the EIF is an annex to this communication. In other words, in practical terms, what is the EIF? It is a framework that guides and supports public administrations in the design of their public services. There are 3 aims. To promote and support and guide public administrations in the provision of public services. So not only that you provide them, this is important, but it's also the level of sophistication of these public services. It's the level of back-end integration that is also important. And this is the level of interoperability, not only at national level, but at cross-border level, which is also important. And, as I said before, to complement and tie together national interoperability frameworks at EU level so that we all can move forward in the same direction. How does it do it? It does it by these 4 things. The first one is the 12 underlying principles. These principles include user centricity, transparency of these public services, multilingualism of these transparencies, and it focuses these 12 principles and it pushes them and recommends that public administrations are built on these underlying principles. It comes up with 4 levels of interoperability. We all probably know them: the semantic, the legal, the technical, and the organizational levels. But on this one I will not dwell very long because my colleague Vito will go into a little bit more detail in that. The concept of interoperability agreements. They are nothing else but cooperation between public administrations in terms of interoperability. For example, in the area of semantic interoperability, we have taxonomies. When agreed by multiple public administrations, could become interoperability agreements. In the area of organizational interoperability, we have SLAs and memorandum of understandings, for example. And then again, when agreed by multiple public administrations, they become interoperability agreements. Last but not least, the governance of interoperability, which means what does the EIF propose in practice? There are a number of domains that interoperability is important, but there are others where a little bit more importance is given to interoperability. Case in point, when businesses would like to open shop in another member state, in job search, for example, in recognition of qualifications and diplomas, in study grants, for example. These are all ideas and sectors where the interoperability focuses on in terms of the European Interoperability Framework. I will stop here now and I will give the floor to Vito, who will continue to explain the 4 levels of interoperability a little bit more in detail and how ESCO fits and is related to a specific one, which is the semantic interoperability. Vito?
Thank you, Aldo. Indeed, I will continue to explore the European Interoperability Framework, and in particular, I will go a little bit more into details in these 4 levels of interoperability. Indeed, this strategy identifies these 4 levels, and why are they important? They are important because if one of these levels fails, then we fail to achieve interoperability in delivering public services. Well, first of all, as a precondition, we need to have a common vision. We have to have common goals and a clear understanding on what are the objectives and the priorities that we set. And this translates in the first level of interoperability, which is the legal level. So we need to have a legislative framework in place that allows us to exchange information. But also, as a negative precondition, we need to remove the legislative obstacles to the successful exchange of information. We also need to be careful that the organizational level of interoperability is taken into account, which means that we need to bring the relevant parties to the table, and we need to agree on how they have to align their business processes. We have to agree on how the organizational cooperation has to be put in place, and even the resources that each party is willing and able to invest. Then we get to the semantic level of interoperability. So we need to make sure that the information that we exchange is understood in the same way throughout the parties involved in the exchange. And then we get to the technical level of interoperability, which has to do to the setup of protocols and informatic systems that are able to communicate with each other. But of course, for our purpose during this conference, what is really important, what ESCO is focused on, is achieving semantic interoperability. And how do we achieve semantic interoperability in practice? Then we can do that by agreeing on generic data models, or also by using reference data like code lists, taxonomies, in the case of ESCO, dictionaries or vocabularies. We call them semantic standards or semantic assets. And by using these standards, we can help to create new value by reusing the data that we have and sharing this data, and increase the integration between the services by sharing this information. And by doing so, we create synergies and we increase the interoperability between systems. But we can ask ourselves why semantic interoperability is important for the labor market. Well, first of all, because it allows us to exchange CVs and vacancies or any kind of labor market information in a way that is understandable for all parties. And this holds true, especially when we have multilingual semantic assets. It holds true across language barriers. It also allows end users, for example, employers and job seekers, to gain access to a wider pool of data, to a wider pool of CVs for the job seekers, to a wider pools of, for the employers, to a wider pool of job vacancies for the job seekers. We also have the possibility to code this data so that we can process huge amount of data through machines. And by doing so, allowing the users to get access to a more targeted and more accurate results when they search for the information that they are looking for. And of course, lower transaction costs by doing so. ESCO, as a reference taxonomy, is a starting point to achieve semantic interoperability of public and private employment services. So this graph was very popular today, so you get to see it again. But on one hand, ESCO allows us to achieve semantic interoperability among employment services by functioning as a hub classification to which different national authorities or owners of other classifications can map. And this, I think, is made also even easier by the fact that ESCO is translated in 22 languages and will soon be available in 25 languages. On the other hand, it allows even end users or users that are not immediately concerned with classifications to be interoperable. And this allows ESCO to be used, for example, by career service counselors, by qualification authorities who can use it to describe learning outcomes, by the end users to compile their CVs or their job vacancies, and also by
online job portals, even in the private sectors. And yes, sorry. As a last slide, I would like to give you a practical example of how these 4 levels of interoperability work together. And we have a very good example with EURES. So in EURES, we have the legal level of interoperability. We have a legal base that allows the public employment services to exchange CVs and vacancies through EURES. We have the organizational level. So all the relevant parties are brought to the table. In the case of EURES, for example, they range from the heads of the public employment services to the EURES high-level strategy group and to the EURES IT group. We have the semantic level of interoperability, and this is where ESCO comes in. But not only ESCO, we also have other classification systems we have, or reference frameworks like the EQF, or ESCO, or the European reference framework for languages. And we have the technical level of interoperability. Martin yesterday said that, mentioned that in the early days of EURES, when it was called SEDOC, telex was used. Fortunately, today we have much more efficient systems, so we have web services that allows to achieve the different IT systems to communicate to each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Does it work? Yes. Thank you, Vito and Aldo. Are there any questions? No questions at this moment. Okay. Might there any questions pop up? I just can... Sorry?
Yes. So Vito also mentioned the issue of ESCO being the reference taxonomy. It also refers, therefore, as one of the examples in the interoperability agreements that I made reference to in my presentation, basically. Then on another topic, Vito mentioned that the portal will now increase from 22 languages to 25 languages. That hopefully will be done by the end of this year, beginning of next, and that will include the Croatian, the Icelandic, and the Norwegian, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong? Okay.
Okay, thank you for this addition.